What chance could a woman possibly have in a naval courtroom, a world governed by men who believed piracy itself was unnatural for her sex? The truth, as history coldly reminds us, was almost none. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the so-called golden age of piracy, women accused of such crimes faced judges already convinced of their guilt. The British Admiralty courts were not places of mercy. Piracy was punishable by death, and a woman accused of it was seen as doubly guilty, for defying both imperial law and the rigid laws of gender. These trials were not held in the Grand Courts of London but in the humid colonies, in Jamaica, in New Providence, under the watch of naval officers who served as judge, jury, and executioner. No juries, no appeals, and little room for defense. The proceedings were swift, but never just. The court wanted a spectacle. Witnesses came forward. Ship captains, naval officers, and trembling sailors, eager to save their own necks. Their testimonies, honest or not, became the noose around the accused woman's throat. These trials were not about justice but about theater, a warning to anyone who might dare to follow their path. Among the most infamous stood and Bonnie and Mary Red, names that would echo through the centuries as symbols of defiance. In 1720, both women faced the Admiralty Court in Spanish Town, Jamaica. Captured alongside their lover and captain, Calico Jack Rackham, they became the talk of the colonies. The surviving court record remains one of the most haunting relics of that era. When Bonnie heard her lover's sentence, death by hanging, she turned to him and spat the words that would immortalize her. "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." It was defiance, pure and burning. One of the few moments when her voice truly mattered. Their only hope for survival lay in an ancient plea, pleading the belly. This loophole allowed pregnant women to postpone execution until after childbirth. For Bonnie and Red it worked for a time. Both were found to be quick with child, and the gallows waited. But mercy was only an illusion. Reed died in prison months later, likely from fever. Bonnie's fate was never certain. Some claim she escaped, others that she died quietly in her cell. What is certain is that their trial exposed the cold cruelty of an empire that demanded obedience, even in death. For most women accused of piracy, there was no such escape. Their verdicts were decided long before they ever entered the courtroom. To be accused was to be condemned. The Thames lay silent that morning, the water softly striking the wooden docks, until the drums began to roll. At London's notorious execution dock in Wapping, thousands gathered to watch pirates meet their end. The British Empire turned death into theater, a dark reminder that no crime went unpunished and no rebel remained unbroken. Men and women alike swung from the same gallows, their bodies twisting above the Grey River. Under British maritime law, piracy was a capital crime. The Piracy Act of 1698, passed under King William III, left no space for pity. All and every person so offending shall suffer pains of death. This was not justice. This was empire speaking through the rope. Unlike executions on land, these deaths belonged to the sea. Execution dock itself was a grim symbol, set just above the tidal line so that the condemned would die where the land met the sea. The message was unmistakable. The same tide that once carried them toward liberty would now flow over their lifeless bodies. Those sentenced were taken from Newgate Prison, paraded through the streets in open carts surrounded by guards. The crowds shouted, vendors sold ale, and the air was heavy with a mix of excitement and dread. At Wapping, the prisoners stood under the gallows, sometimes already with the rope tight around their necks. Unlike the cleaner drop used in later times, this was slower and more cruel. The short drop, meant to choke rather than break the neck, could take several minutes before death finally came. Sailors called it the marshal's dance because of the convulsions that shook the body as it fought for breath. Even in death, pirates were denied any dignity. Women were seldom among the condemned, but when they were, the brutality was no less. Their gender did not protect them. Instead, it made the execution even more sensational. One example was Mary Critchett, an American woman who, in 1729, joined a group of escaped convicts who became pirates. She and her companions were captured off the coast of Virginia and brought to trial in Williamsburg. There was no romance, no last-minute pardon, only the judgment. She was sentenced to hang, and the execution was quick. There was no plea of pregnancy, no mercy, and no delay. She was executed quietly, as she had lived, her name disappearing beneath the fame of her male comrades. These deaths were not only punishment, they were performances. The British Crown used them to maintain the illusion of order and to remind the colonies who ruled the seas. Each hanging was a sermon on authority. And for the most notorious among them, death did not end with the rope. The worst offenders were gibbeted, their bodies chained and left to rot until the tide washed over them 3 times. The smell, the sight, the horror. All of it was meant to burn fear and obedience into public memory. Though gibbeting was mostly used on men, the same threat hung over women. It did not matter whether one was pirate or passenger. To be accused meant to become an example. Beneath the gallows, a woman who once commanded ships and men became nothing more than a warning. Her defiance was erased. Her name turned into a moral tale whispered in taverns and sermons. To the Empire, she was not a rebel to be understood. She was an error to be erased. At execution dock, justice wore the mask of ceremony. The shouting of the crowd, the tolling of the bells, the rising tide. All of it came together like a ritual. Each hanging reaffirmed the crown's power over the chaos of the sea. But beneath that ritual lay fear, fear of rebellion, fear of women who fought beside men, fear of a world where the old order could crumble. And so, the Empire turned execution into theater, and the woman pirate into a symbol of everything that had to be destroyed. Before the rope, there was the whip. For many captured women, punishment began long before the gallows. Flogging, an old, torturous form of discipline, was the favorite tool of authority, meant to wound the body and crush the will. In ports like Kingston and Port Royal, crowds gathered to witness these public floggings. For naval officers and colonial governors, it was a reminder that rebellion, especially from a woman, would not be tolerated. The instrument was the cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip made of 9 knotted cords, each capable of cutting through skin with every strike. Sentences ranged from a dozen lashes to more than 100, depending on the magistrate's mood. 1 lash could draw blood. 100 could strip flesh to the bone. The condemned were tied to a post or to the mast of a ship, their clothing torn away until bare skin met the punishment of the law. The first blow fell in silence. Then came gasps, cries, and cheers as each strike cut deeper. For women, the cruelty carried another purpose. It was not only physical but moral. Their suffering was meant to humiliate, degrade, and turn defiance into spectacle. When Bonnie and Mary Red were captured in Jamaica in 1720, rumors circulated that they were beaten and mistreated in prison even before their trial began. Though no official record confirms any flogging, the very idea reflects the cruelty of the age. Other women captured for piracy were not so fortunate. In the colonies of North America and the West Indies, public whippings of female convicts, sailors, and accused pirates were a common sight. Some were punished for mutiny, others for theft, and some merely for being seen as troublesome. Naval officers believed that to break a woman's body was to break her will. Witnesses told how the whip would strike again and again until the victim fell to the ground or lost consciousness. The executioners were often drunk or careless. Their goal was not fairness, but display. For the crowd, it was both a warning and entertainment. For the authorities, it was a way to maintain control. When the punishment ended, the woman was left to rot in her cell or wander through the streets, her back torn and bleeding, her dignity destroyed. There were no doctors, no compassion, no care, only the lesson that both the sea and the Empire belonged to men. A flogging was more than pain. It was a public declaration that the Empire owned your body. For women pirates, that message cut deeper than the lash itself. Not every woman captured aboard a pirate ship was sentenced to die. Some were spared, but their survival became a different kind of death. In the Caribbean, West Africa, and the American colonies, captured female pirates, especially women of color, were frequently sold, enslaved, or forced into concubinage. The British were not the only ones who did this. Spanish and Portuguese colonials blurred the lines between piracy, privateering, and slavery, until justice was decided by strength, not law. When a pirate ship was taken, its crew was divided into groups. Those to be tried, those to be executed, and those to be sold. Women rarely fit any clear category, so their fate depended completely on who captured them. In the port cities of Portobello and Cartagena, archives describe women taken from pirate ships and recorded as spoils of war. Their names disappeared. Their lives were entered only as property records. Some were sent to plantations as slaves. Others became household servants or concubines for merchants and colonial officials. Race, class, and nationality determined everything. A white English woman might be imprisoned or deported. An African or indigenous woman might be sold the very same day. Historians find these stories hard to trace because they were never meant to survive. Official records almost never mention women as pirates. Those who did appear were listed as wives, companions, or slaves, even if they had fought alongside men. To the Empire, a woman who sailed under the black flag was a contradiction that had to be erased, so they erased her. On captured ships, female prisoners were often distributed among the victors, sometimes under the appearance of mercy. In truth, it was possession disguised as kindness. For such women, capture meant disappearance. They were stripped of their names, their freedom, and their history. They did not die on the gallows or hang at execution dock. They simply vanished, absorbed into the machinery of empire. Their silence became their punishment. And in that silence, the empire kept its illusion of moral order. Men were punished as criminals. Women were absorbed as property. Both fates served one purpose: to erase rebellion. There was another punishment, quieter than the rest. For those who escaped the gallows but not captivity, death came slowly aboard the prison hulks, decaying ships anchored in the harbors of the empire. By the 18th century, Britain's jails were overflowing. Rebellions, piracy, and colonial wars filled every cell, so the authorities turned to the sea itself for an answer. Old warships, stripped of their masts and sails, their wood dark with rot, were turned into floating prisons. They were called hulks, and for many, they became floating graves. Inside their dark and airless holds, hundreds of prisoners were chained together. Men, women, and sometimes even children. The smell of sweat, sewage, and disease was unbearable. There was no sunlight, no fresh air, and barely any clean water. Food came in buckets, salted meat and moldy bread. Those who fell ill rarely survived. Typhus, smallpox, scurvy, and dysentery spread rapidly. Doctors came only to count the bodies. For the women prisoners, especially those accused of piracy, life aboard the hulks was even more cruel. They were few in number, without protection, and often targeted by guards or sailors. Some were forced into service, others were abused, their bodies treated as trade within the ship's corrupt order. Few records survive about women dying on these ships, but that silence says more than any written list ever could. The empire recorded executions because they were lessons for the public. It did not record death by hunger, sickness, or assault. Those were quiet deaths, unseen, unspoken, and perhaps more convenient. From Portsmouth to Kingston, the hulks decayed in the shallow waters, their decks groaning under the weight of suffering. When the tide rose, it carried the stench of death through the harbor towns, a reminder of what awaited those who defied the empire. For many women, this was the true end of piracy, not the spectacle of the gallows, but the slow suffocation of forgotten existence. No final words, no crowd, only darkness and the clinking of chains moving with the tide. Their deaths were not accidents of justice but instruments of control. The empire did not merely punish rebellion, it erased it. Every lash, every hanging, every nameless death aboard a prison ship served one purpose: to remind the world that women who defied the natural order would disappear from it. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were deliberate and systematic displays of power, rituals that turned living women into examples and examples into silence. Because silence, to an empire, was the purest form of obedience. Their punishments were never simple sentences. They were tools, crafted to carve submission into the world. Every trial, every lash, every rope tightening around a woman's throat carried the same message: to warn what happened when one stepped beyond her place. For the British Admiralty, suppressing piracy was not just enforcing law, it was about preserving the illusion of order. Pirates, whether men or women, symbolized chaos. But female pirates? They were something far more dangerous, living contradictions. They represented a question the Empire could not answer. What if women refused to obey? The maritime order was built on hierarchy. Captain over sailor, man over woman, empire over all. A woman who seized a ship or wielded a blade threatened that structure at its core. She made visible what was never meant to be seen, and the empire reacted with vengeance. For every Anne Bonny or Mary Read whose names survived in history, there were dozens more whose stories disappeared completely. Women who sailed, fought, and perished, but whose lives dissolved into the fog of forgotten records and silent prisons. Their disappearance was no accident. It was deliberate. What truly terrified the Empire was not that such women had lived, but that they might be remembered. When we look back at the so-called Golden Age of piracy, we often picture a world of adventure, gold coins, black flags, cannon smoke, and defiance. But the truth was far colder. Piracy, especially for women, was never a path to freedom. It was a brief rebellion in a world that punished rebellion with deliberate cruelty. In the colonial ports, executions turned into performances. Authorities organized them like plays, complete with processions, speeches, and lessons in morality. The condemned stood at the center of this spectacle not as human beings, but as stage props. The gallows at Wapping became their stage. The crowd was the audience, and the Empire the author of the script. When a female pirate hung from the rope, the message was unmistakable. This is what happens when a woman forgets her place. Her pain became a sermon. Her silence, the moral of the tale. Even the location of the execution dock held deep symbolism. It sat just below the high water line, where the rule of land met the freedom of the sea. To die there was to be claimed by both. In its last act of power, the Empire made sure that even death would not return them to the ocean they once commanded. There was always something deeply disturbing to the male world about a woman who held power on the sea. Sailors whispered that women aboard ships brought misfortune, that they stirred the wind and cursed the voyage. But beneath that superstition lay fear. The sea had long been imagined as female, wild, deep, and beyond control. So when women took to the decks armed with pistols and cutlasses, it felt as if the sea itself had rebelled against its masters. And Bonny, Mary Read, Mary Critchett, and countless unnamed women became symbols of that fear. They did not just defy the law, they defied the story men told about how the world should be. The Empire responded not only with punishment, but with control over the narrative. Chroniclers wrote of them as unnatural, monstrous, or corrupted by desire. Their rebellion was rewritten as madness, their bravery as sin. History allowed them to exist only as cautionary tales, never as leaders, never as women who made choices or commanded ships. After the hangings, after the whippings, after the prison hulks had rotted away, what endured longer than the punishments themselves was silence. Official records became quieter. Names vanished from archives. Graves remained unmarked. This was how the Empire hid its shame, not buried in earth, but buried in memory. The few stories that survived did so through gossip and song, passed along by sailors who half believed them. Over time, the woman pirate became a legend, a symbol of rebellion, danger, and desire. But in turning them into myths, history took away their humanity. The woman became the ghost became the warning, and the real lives, those who loved, fought, and suffered, were buried beneath layers of moral storytelling. The sea, once their refuge, became their grave. To study these women is to study what is missing. Their stories remind us not only of cruelty, but of how power decides who is remembered and who is erased. When a woman challenged empire on land, she was called a witch. When she did it at sea, she was called a pirate. Both were punished for the same defiance, refusing silence. Their stories reveal that even the ocean, vast as it was, remained under the empire's reach. Even the waves that once carried them toward freedom were turned into instruments of control. But one question remains. If so much effort was spent to erase them, What does that say about the power they truly possessed? Centuries have passed since the hangings at Execution Dock. The gallows are gone, the crowds dispersed, and the empire itself has faded into memory. Yet the pattern still survives. The same systems that silenced women pirates now silence others who dare to cross invisible lines of gender, class, race, or obedience. The tools have changed, but the purpose remains: to dominate, to rewrite, to erase. But history, no matter how carefully censored, always leaves an echo. Each time we speak the names in Bonnie, Mary Red, or Mary Critchett, we challenge the silence that the empire demanded. Every retelling, every act of remembering, becomes a rebellion in itself. Their stories were meant to warn. Instead, they became reflections. So what do their erasures reveal about power, about justice, about who the world chooses to remember? Perhaps the answer lies not in the gallows or the courtroom, but in the silence that followed. As the Roman historian Tacitus once wrote, "The more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws." And in the empire's desperate attempt to outlaw disobedience, it exposed the one thing it could never control: the will to be free.